Well, thank you very much for joining us for another wonderful edition of Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. This beautiful Tuesday, the last Tuesday of April 2025, Tuesday, April 29, 2025. How have you been? Hope you've had a wonderful month thus far and hope you're preparing for the new month. Well, today we are going to look very much into the issue of designing national strategies for research commercialization. I'm going to say that again. Today, our focus is going to be on designing national strategies for research commercialization, right? But before we go deeply into that, we're going to do a quick recap of some of the things we discussed last week, right? Last week, we looked at the issue of how do we, ensure we extract optimal economic value from innovative activities in a nation, right? Again, you're very welcome to this edition, this third edition of Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. My name is Tolu Omodara. This is Amoge Radio Communications. It's a joy, it's a delight, it's a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful last Tuesday of April 2025, right? So, last week, we're looking at how do we ensure we extract optimal economic value from innovative activities in a nation. Because if you're not careful, a lot of creativity will be happening, but there would be no innovation because there is no innovation until there's commercialization, right? We've been talking about that a lot, even from last quarter, and we are emphasizing it more deeply this quarter when we are looking at driving economic growth with innovation. So in order to translate creative activities into optimal economic value, right, that economic innovation, we need to ensure that we are sort of pre-designing these into our national innovation systems, right? Because economic value is derived when implementation frameworks are designed, for ensuring experimentation and scaling of ideas. I didn't say that again. Economic value is derived when implementation frameworks are deliberately instituted, deliberately established, deliberately strengthened for experimentation and scaling, which leads to full-scale commercialization, right? So when you have an idea, that's just creativity. But when you have frameworks for implementation, then you have innovation. There is no innovation until there is implementation and commercialization. So that's one of the things we talked about last week. We said it is important that nations begin to, if necessary, establish innovation implementation institutes to stimulate the execution of creative ideas. I'm going to say that again. We said some nations need to look at themselves and need to say, do we need to establish innovation implementation institutes to deliberately stimulate execution of creative ideas? If those nations do an audit, right, an innovation audit, an audit of the innovation systems, take a measure of how much of the creative ideas that are generated by inventors actually make it to full-scale commercialization, right? They need to look at that, do those reviews, do those audits, do those evaluations, and if there is a huge gap or a considerable gap, a significant gap between the creative ideas that are being generated by inventors and those that actually make it to full-scale innovation, full-scale commercialization, right? Then such nations may need to consider establishing innovation implementation institutes to stimulate, deliberately and strategically stimulate execution of creative ideas. Again, we are emphasizing this because it's not about the ideas that are generated in the nation, it's not about the quality of human capital sometimes, but more about the innovation systems, the national innovation systems, and we are now looking at a specific aspect of the national innovation systems, and that is the one that stimulates or the one that guarantees the execution that leads to commercialization, not just any kind of execution, right? So we are not just talking about experimentation of ideas, we are now talking about scaling, experimentation that will lead to scaling and that will lead to full-scale commercialization, right? Scaling is when you do it on a larger level, right? Having first experimented, refined, fine-tuned the prototype, right? Then you must go on from there to scale, in other words, to sell in larger volumes, right? And that's where you begin to derive much more efficient returns on the innovation investments you have made, right? So we also say that creativity may be conceptualization, but innovation, especially the one that drives economic growth, is implementation. I'll say that again. Creativity may be conceptualization, but innovation, especially the one that drives economic value, is implementation. And we know why we are emphasizing this issue of implementation. We can tell you as consultants, as management consultants that have worked across sectors, public sector, private sector, non-profit sector, that many times there is a huge gap between policy and execution, a significant bridge between strategy and implementation, right? And so the innovation implementation frameworks need to be strong, right? Some of these things include what we called last quarter innovation as coordination. It's still coming up in this quarter because innovative activities, especially the implementation part of creative ideas, take more than the inventors. We said this last week and we are repeating it. Many times the inventor may come up with the creative idea by him or herself or by themselves if they're a team. When you're talking about full-scale commercialization, you're going to need some people, you're going to need a team, right? Now, that's not just the inventing team, but the implementation team, all the way to marketing, not just the execution or the manufacturing or the quality assurance, even all the way to those who will be deliberately pushing and marketing the product. Very important, because you're talking about globally competitive ideas. You are probably not the only one, and you can learn from the research example in the United States. Artificial intelligence was almost a mono US thing until China came with DeepSeek, and all of a sudden the so to say competitive edge that the United States has is being so significantly threatened that this week it's been said that the organizations referred to as the Magnificent Seven, right? That's the Apple, the Nvidia, the Microsoft, and so on and so forth. I think they've taken about 25% decline, loss, a 25% hit on their cumulative share value in the United States. That is what has happened as a result of global competitiveness. So when you hear innovation, I want you to know that it goes beyond creativity. It's a whole team. It's a whole implementation team that ensures that the creative ideas are not just making it to the implementation level, but they are also being perfected on a continuous basis. They are being scaled, and they are also being marketed and made continuously competitive. Very, very important. I remember we are discussing it at the national level here. So it is critical that we see that aspect, right? That aspect of innovation being implementation, and that is end-to-end, full-scale, and whole spectrum implementation. Now, innovation systems must be deliberately designed to produce economic value. I need to say that again. Innovation systems, not just creativity systems, but the innovation systems which would only be so worth which will only earn the name if it leads to commercialization. Those innovation systems must be deliberately designed to promote and to guarantee economic value. In other words, when nations are making those national investments, they need to be doing so with deliberate economic goals. I need to say that. Deliberate economic goals. This is one thing we didn't say last week, but we're going to talk more about it this week. There must be clear economic goals. We want to grow our GDP by X percentage. We want to grow our GDP per capita by X percentage. We want to have improved in this specific area. Either it's economic diversification goals. There must be very clear economic goals that are tied to those innovation investments. So we highlighted it, we summarized it last week and said innovation systems must be deliberately designed to produce economic value. This week we're talking about specific targets, right? There must be clear strategic goals that are tied to those innovation activities, such that even those who are creating, the inventors as well as their support teams, understand that there is a direct goal in mind. Now, all types of innovation are supposed to anticipate and respond to market needs, whether it's incremental innovation, or it's the architectural innovation, or the discontinuous innovation, which can be more radical, right? Whatever kind of innovation it is, it's supposed to anticipate and respond to market needs. Very, very important, right? Now, if that does not happen, it may be difficult to ensure optimal economic value, because you may be playing catch up with the innovation, with the creativities, right? You may be playing catch up with the inventors. But if ab initio, the National Innovation Strategy, the National Innovation Policy is already, imbued, already has embedded into it that economic value orientation, then even those who are working either on products, on services, on processes, whatever aspect of innovation they are working on, they are doing so with a deliberate mind to ensure that there is economic value derived from it. Extremely important. So that way, there would also be more of market research, because when you're talking about economic value, it's also not just about what exploratory innovation, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, but the exploitative innovation that is anticipating and responding to market needs. Very, very important. Of course, exploratory innovation is still important, where you just generate ideas for the sake of ideas, but the most promising of those ideas should be channeled deliberately to the exploitative innovation, which is anticipating and responding to market needs. My name is Teotolo Madara. This is Amoge Radio Communications, and we're talking about driving economic growth with innovation. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, so you need to determine how much of, for instance, national funds should go to exploratory versus exploitative innovation that would be directed more at those market needs. Again, we are emphasizing that exploratory innovation is still important. That's creativity for the sake of creativity, but there must be, from a planning point of view, from a strategic planning point of view, a certain determination of what percentage of funds should go to exploratory innovation and what percentage of funds should go to the exploitative innovation, which is directed more at meeting those market needs. Of course, we also emphasize the fact that the bridge between conceptualization and commercialization is codification. Very, very important. Now, codification helps to, guarantee exclusive intellectual ownership. Now, this is not just about translating creative ideas into economic value. This is also ensuring that your potential economic value does not go unrewarded, so to say, or does not become something that is up for grabs. Because if you generate ideas and, for instance, you don't patent them, you don't codify them, you don't translate tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge, and you're not prompt to put them into some kind of a prototype or a software or a manual or something that you can now go to the intellectual property organizations to register, then it is highly economically careless. And unfortunately, this happens a lot in some nations that do not have a codification strategy. So it's very, very important that this bridge between conceptualization and commercialization, which is codification, must become something that nations begin to work on for intellectual ownership ease, right? For the ease of intellectual ownership to be ascribed to the deserving nations, to those whose nationals have actually invented and created, then codification must be built into the commercialization strategy of innovation. I repeat, codification must be built into the commercialization strategy of innovation in order to guarantee that intellectual ownership can be appropriately ascribed. Very, very important. Nations that do not have a strategy for codification as part of the national innovation systems may be losing a lot. It is economically careless for nations not to have a sound codification policy, right? So it's important that we need to have innovation, but we must also have a codification strategy. We need to have innovation systems, but we must also have a codification and innovation codification strategy within that national innovation policy or process or systems, as the case may be. Now, like we like we're advocating for National Innovation Implementation Institute, we are also advocating for National Institutes for Innovation Codification in nations that know they may need to build a lot of capacity in this regard, need to build structures in this regard, and so on and so forth, right? Now, that was some of those are some of the highlights of last week's episode. Please check out our YouTube page, Amoge Radio Communications. You will look at last week's episode and many other episodes, even from last quarter, where we looked at developing national innovation systems for absorptive capacity. This week, we want to begin to look at designing national strategies for research commercialization. I repeat, designing national strategies for research commercialization. What is this going to talk about? We want to talk a little bit about how do we, ensure that we are commercializing research. Again, it's like saying it's not innovation for the sake of innovation. Research many times leads to innovation, especially the exploratory part of innovation that may not necessarily be targeted at specific market needs, but is just generating ideas. Now, we've talked about anticipating and responding to market needs, but sometimes you can also stimulate market needs. I repeat, we've talked about anticipating and responding to market needs, but with exploratory innovation, you can actually stimulate market needs. Let me give you an example. When the touch screen was invented, there may not necessarily have been a specific market demand for it, but sometimes as a creator, as an inventor, you are stimulating market needs, and that is perfectly okay. The problem is that if you do not have a strategy for commercializing research, even those exploratory innovations may just be left at the level of ideas, right? But once there is a national strategy for research commercialization, then almost every idea that is generated, especially the one that is capable of generating economic value, is now deliberately turned into a commercializable tool, right? And please remember, we are very aggressive in this quarter about economic value that needs to be derived from innovation. So it may look like we're just talking about how do we derive economic value. Yes, that is the focus of this quarter's program, driving economic growth with innovation. And I need to say that this is especially important, like I said, for nations sometimes that have been overly dependent on, for instance, raw materials, nations that have not learned to add economic value, that are not operating at the competitive ends of the global value chain, that are only exporting the raw materials, and sometimes if they're not careful, they are re-importing the finished goods from their raw materials at a significantly higher cost because they have not added value. So we need to begin to look at how do we, drive economic growth through innovation, especially innovation that can deliver maximum value. And often the maximum value comes from operating at the higher ends of the global competitive chain. Those higher ends are the ends where you have added more value to products, right? The more you have added the value to products, in other words, the more you have moved it from its raw state to a more finished product, the higher the value you can derive. Now, of course, there's the mid states. For instance, if you produce microchips like a nation like Taiwan, you are not necessarily at the raw material end of it, neither are you at the finished end of it. It's not the laptop, but you are somewhere in the middle. So those nations that operate in those middle parts, or in that middle end, so to say, of the global value chain, also derive more value than those who simply export raw materials. This past week, I was reading, I think the outgoing leader of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, was complaining about the significantly high value that Africa loses by exporting materials in its raw state. Of course, we have known this for decades. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's why we are canvassing aggressively this quarter that it is time for national innovation institutes, for national innovation policies, and if necessary, sub-strategies like the one we are looking at this week, strategies that are focused in on driving economic growth by ensuring national strategies for research commercialization. Again, I'm still going to go back to the ambidextrous approach, which is our own approach in Amogate, where you're merging the exploratory with the exploitative innovation. So much as the research we're talking about here, when we talk about research commercialization, may be more about, just generally exploratory innovation, because sometimes creativity is supposed to be uninhibited, right? Sometimes when you put certain market needs, it could be a bit defining, it could be a bit it could be a bit containing, so to say. There is a place for that, especially with exploitative innovation. But we will still always push for the ambidextrous approach, where a part of the research should be directed at just exploring, and a certain part of the research should now be directed at exploiting the research insights that have been generated from the exploratory phase, and that is where the commercialization comes in. So we are strongly advocating for both. Very, very important. There must be the exploratory approach to innovation, which just allows people to generate ideas for the sake of generating ideas. But the ideas that are generated at that exploratory research level must then be commercialized. And we are strongly advocating that there must be deliberate national strategies for research commercialization, which takes the insights created, the insights generated from that exploratory approach, from that exploratory phase, and then converts it into commercializable value. And that for us should be directed more at market needs and also at national level needs. As a nation, it's time to be, if for instance, the United States knows that under Trump administration, they want to be driving more of manufacturing, they want to bring back manufacturing jobs, then they need to begin to have more of the kind of research that can help to stimulate a manufacturing friendly environment. What are the factors that make China, for instance, more manufacturing friendly? What were the challenges to manufacturing in the United States? Again, like we've been saying on this program, there must be grants, there must be fellowship, there must be research funding, deliberately targeted at addressing those areas. And that is why it is important to know that innovation is not just about products. We said it and we're going to repeat it. We said it a lot in the last episode, in the last quarter. We've said it in previous episodes of this quarter. It's about products, it's about service, it's about process innovation sometimes. Sometimes it's not just the product. Sometimes you have to look at the process. What was it about the manufacturing process in the United States that made China a more friendly destination for manufacturing? That's something President Trump is trying to reverse now, and it's not necessarily bad. The approach, the timing may not be perfect, but that's not necessarily bad. For other nations, you have to look at the areas in which you need to drive innovation, especially the one that helps you to commercialize research, especially the research insights that are garnered from the exploratory phase. Now, you may want to ask, are you saying, Tolu, that there is no research to be insights to be garnered from the exploitative phase? No, but the exploitative phase tends to be more directed at perfecting what was begun at the exploratory phase. I repeat, the exploitative phase of research tends to be targeted more at, optimizing and narrowing, to the point of implementation, the research insights that was garnered at the exploratory phase. So we are still repeating and emphasizing the need for the ambidextrous approach. And we are saying that if you do not have a strategy for commercializing research, many of the insights which are garnered at the exploratory phase may just be left untapped, right? And that's why we are still saying that a framework for this should be tied to national economic goals. What exactly are national economic goals? That's where it should begin, in our own opinion. We strongly opine that you should begin with your national economic goals, economic diversification, economic GDP, for instance, economic goals that have to do with GDP growth, GDP per capita improvement, and so on and so forth. Once you have those metrics and the targeted objectives clearly defined, you now come to research and say, what role is research going to play in helping us to achieve economic growth? For us, the overall impact should be economy before research. I'm going to say that again, it may sound contentious, but please think through it. The overall goal when you're talking about driving economic growth with innovation, we think you put the chicken before the egg when you put research before the economy. The economy must come before the research. When the economic goals are clearly defined, we now come to the research level and say, okay, what role is research going to play in helping us attain this economic growth? That way, even when it's exploratory research, it is still targeted at the growth of the economy. It's still targeted at the development of the economy, given the clear metrics that have been predefined. Extremely important, right? And when you're talking about the exploitative research, even also at that level, you are now channeling the insights on the exploratory phase of the ambidextrous research. You are now channeling the insights of the exploratory phase to exploitative research, exploitative fine-tuning. And when you have this exploitative fine-tuning, you are more intentional about them because they are directed, like we said, at those economic goals. Very, very important. My name is Tolu Omadara. This is Amogere Communications. We're looking at driving economic growth with innovation. This is the theme of this quarter's program. And today's episode specifically is directed at designing national strategies for research commercialization. I repeat, designing national strategies for research commercialization. Just today I was reading an article by a chief technology officer in the United States, I think at Morgan Stanley. And she was discussing the issue of, tech for tech's sake versus when technology officers are working in tandem with business officers. business managers, business strategists. And when they are developing technology, it's no longer just tech for tech's sake, but it's tech that is directed at solving business needs. In other words, at the end of the day, she began to say that it was important to have tech business orientation or business technologies. I think that was the terminology she used. And that's what we are advocating here, right? At the end of the day, the chief technology officers that are becoming more and more relevant are those who are fine-tuning their approaches and ensuring that their innovation is directed at solving business needs. Now, does that mean that they are no longer, engaging their imagination? Then that defeats the purpose of innovation. But is it imagination just for the sake of imagination? Definitely not. They are now working in sync with the business leaders. So that's what we are saying. At the national level, it is important that, like the business leaders of the private sector, those that are managing the economy, the managers of national economies, must be setting the economic goals that those in charge of innovation, the national innovation leaders, those responsible for developing national innovation systems and so overseeing their implementation, are now working in tandem with them such that there is an effective, seamless synergy between innovation and economy. And like I said earlier, we still stand by that. It is supposed to be the economy before the innovation. It is supposed to be the business before the technology in the private sector. You have clear business goals. There's a market penetration rate you want to attain. There is a level of product orientation you want to increase, or you want to even have a market orientation. All of these goals must be defined at the strategy level, at the business strategy level. Then you have the chief technology officers working in tune with the working in tune with the business leaders to ensure the attainment of those business goals using technology. So that's what we are strongly advocating for. It should be the economy before innovation. The economic goals must be clearly articulated by whatever metrics that are important, and then it's now important for the national innovation leaders or those responsible for designing and implementing national innovation systems to work towards the attainment of those national economic goals. Of course, co-creation is very critical here. When I say co-creation, the national innovation leaders should ensure that there is effective cascading of these economic goals. Remember, we said it a lot on last quarter. Please revisit those episodes on our YouTube page, Amoge Radio Communications. Many times you have those who are oriented only towards science and innovation, sometimes not speaking the language of business and economy, and the other way around. And that's why we've kept saying that ultimately you'll find that more and more programs, either in academia or in business, in industry or in policy, are now speaking the language of multidisciplinary orientation. We've been canvassing for this a lot, especially on these programs, from developing a national human capital policy 2 quarters ago to developing national innovation systems to absorptive capacity last quarter. And even this quarter, we've been saying that we need to raise multidisciplinary human capital intentionally. So we have scientists who automatically understand the language of economy, and we also have economists who can also help to connect with the innovation passionate ones. It is extremely important. But if a nation has already educated a certain generation in a manner that is not necessarily multidisciplinary, for those who are still in the re-education phase, those that can still be reoriented, remember, the 21st century illiterate is not he who cannot read and write, but he who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So for those who can still unlearn, relearn, and learn, it is very important that we begin to reorientate them such that even the best of scientists, the most inclined towards science, can begin to speak the language of business and economy, and those who are also strongly oriented towards economy can also understand how to collaborate effectively with the scientists, with the natural inventors, to ensure that they're achieving economic goals. This is extremely important. A mono approach, a silo approach is not going to achieve what we are canvassing for passionately in this quarter's program. Driving economic growth innovation is not going to happen in silos. It's going to take a very strong collaboration orientation to ensure that scientists and economists are coming together, where the economists are setting the overall national economic goals and engaging the innovators to support them, to even begin by identifying where innovators, inventors, scientists can come in to contribute to the attainment of those economic goals. I know this can be a lot to process, but this is very, very important. These are national conversations. These are policy discussions. This is an important dialogue. It is very, very important, and that's why we are, like I've been saying since the beginning of this quarter, especially since the beginning of this particular program, we are not necessarily looking at innovation alone, right? We are not even devoting most of this quarter's program to innovation. We are looking more at the economic growth aspect of it and how to use innovation to drive economic growth. Hence the theme, driving economic growth with innovation. Well, I think we're going to draw a curtain on this week's edition of the program at this point, right? I hope you have understood part of what we are saying. You have understood the need to, not just, have codification as an afterthought, not just have commercialization as an after the fact of innovation, but to actually lay economic goals as the foundation for innovative activities. Extremely important. That way, we are much more likely to drive economic growth more intentionally, more strategically, more efficiently, and more optimally with innovation. It's been so nice doing this with you. Remember, you are the reason why we do this. We love having you on the program every Tuesday. We will be back same time, same station next week by the grace of God, and we go deeper into these issues. Until then, remember, my colleagues will be here Wednesday through Friday, and again on Monday. We'll continue to bring you issues, conversations, very important, critical dialogues on strategy, on policy, on international issues, on national issues, on education that would help to rebuild, reform, and strengthen your national institutions, your organizational strategies. And remember, you are the reason why we do this. And we look forward to partner with you as Amogate. This is our strength. This is our passion. We have demonstrable proven expertise of close to 2 decades in this. So please engage us. Let's work with you. This is not just theoretical for us. We have helped to institute such processes in national organizations, in multinational national organizations, in private sector organizations, in public sector organizations, in supranational organizations, and we would love to do this with you. Let's talk strategy, let's talk policy, and let's talk national innovation processes, especially for driving economic growth. Well, I look forward to being back same time, same station next week. Until then, do not just think innovation for the sake of innovation, but think innovation for the purpose of driving economic growth. See you next week and have a good one.